So I am most pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Xiaoquan Zhao. Dr. Zhao is a professor in the Department of Communication at George Mason University. His research focuses on health message design and effects, evaluation of public communication campaigns, health information seeking, news effects on health and risk perceptions, and information disparities affecting vulnerable populations. The substantive topics of his work include tobacco control, substance use disorder, cancer prevention, immigrant health, and climate change. Dr. Zhao has published widely in journals of communication and public health. Since 2014, he has served as subject matter expert and scientific advisor to the Division of Research and Evaluation in the Office of Health Communication and Education at FDA's Center for Tobacco Products, providing wide-ranging research support for FDA's ongoing national tobacco education campaigns. Dr. Zhao is a senior editor for the journal Health Communication, which, as you know, is a flagship journal in HealthCom. Well, Dr. Zhao is way too humble. In the bio he sent me, he is a leading scholar in health communication, and we're very pleased to have him today. He will be talking about a very timely issue we're encountering right now, that is message fatigue and uptake of COVID-19 vaccine boosters. Okay, so I'm gonna give it to you, Dr. Zhao, for to take the stage over.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Nan, for that wonderful introduction. A pleasure to be here. And I'm surprised to see such a large audience. A real pleasure to be able to talk to you about some new work that I've been involved in. And this is actually an important caveat that this is research in progress. So it's in many ways still a little bit rough, and I'm eager to hear your thoughts. And if you have, suggestions, comments, those would be most welcome. I also want to be fully transparent that I've been talking about this project elsewhere as well, but I can promise you that what I'm sharing today is mostly new. So I'm sharing some new analysis. And I thought, what I have to share today is very interesting, and I hope that you will feel the same way. All right, so the topic of my talk is message fatigue and uptake of vaccine boosters in the United States. And I added a subtitle actually just to differentiate what I'm talking about today to some previous talks. I'm focusing on an ecological perspective. Hopefully, I will be able to make that clear as the talk progresses. Let's see if I can move. Okay, but first off, I want to acknowledge the important contributions of the COVID States Project. It is a huge project led by many PIs, but two PIs that have been tremendously supportive of this particular project are Dr. Druckmann from Northwestern and Dr. Ognyanova from Rutgers. And also I have a team of collaborators, including folks from George Mason University, where I teach, and also some folks from Forest Marsh Group. All right, so fatigue, I think it's a common and, prevalent theme of public discourse around COVID-19, right? We're really in the fourth year of the pandemic already, and fatigue is everywhere. And fatigue is generated on so many different levels. We know that fatigue is a leading symptom of long COVID, right? And also we experience fatigue not only physically, but mentally. And we should probably also recognize that at least some of that fatigue, particularly on the mental side, is caused by overexposure to public health messaging. And this concern actually was raised very early. I was actually surprised to see that World Health Organization already had a report out by the end of, I think it's October of 2020, addressing pandemic fatigue. All right. And this kind of concern was raised as early as April 2020. Now, this report has raised awareness of the importance of pandemic fatigue, and among many other things it has done, it has specifically noted the fact that fatigue is, a factor in our motivation to engage in an actual performance of protective behaviors during the pandemic. Now, obviously, we're not dealing with pandemic fatigue. We're dealing with maybe a specific subdomain of that, more umbrella concept of fatigue. We're focusing on message fatigue. Now, many of you probably are familiar already with Zhao et al. 2017 piece, which does a wonderful job summarizing some of the literature on message fatigue, and also proposed a integrated model, right? So according to Zhao et al., message fatigue is defined as an aversive motivational state of being exhausted and bored by overexposure to similar redundant messages over an extended period of time. And in their model, they identified 4 dimensions: perceived overexposure, perceived redundancy, feeling exhausted, and also feeling tedious and disinterested. And an important distinction, once again, this is a graph that's taken not of Zhao et al. Directly. An important distinction should be made between acute message fatigue and chronic message fatigue. Actually, there has been quite a bit of a research on acute message fatigue, particularly in the persuasion literature, looking at, for example, repeated exposure to the same message within a relatively short amount of time. So that is acute message fatigue. But what we are interested in here is chronic message fatigue, which is basically exposure, to similar messages, not necessarily identical, over a long period of time in various contexts. So what are people tired of hearing about, right? In a recent publication by Guan et al. Did a very interesting study. They had an open-ended question, basically asking people, right, what are you tired of hearing about? And this is part of the results. The list is actually quite long, but as you can see, on top of their list, we see wearing masks, social distancing, washing hands, statistics about COVID deaths and hospitalizations, so on and so forth. So the major public health guidances are, the very target really of fatigue, right? People are experiencing. So this shows that message fatigue is probably a real phenomenon and an important phenomenon too. Now, research on message fatigue, I think it's fair to say it's still relatively new and burgeoning, right? But in a COVID context, we already see some interesting studies. One line of research focuses on the impact of message fatigue on information processing. And the main findings suggest that message fatigue can trigger, passive disengagement, like avoidance, right? But also active resistance, like counter-arguing and reactance. There's also research looking at the relationship between message fatigue and a vulnerability to misinformation, showing that people who are more fatigued are more vulnerable to misinformation. There's also being an interesting study looking at the role of message fatigue in the effectiveness of a campus campaign, right? And it linked message fatigue to specific behaviors such as masking, social distancing, and personal hygiene, right? But so far, at least to the best of our knowledge, we have not seen a study that has looked at, the link between message fatigue and vaccination, and in particular, the uptake of vaccine boosters. So that's the focus of our research. So just a little bit of background. I think this is something that's common knowledge, but some of the statistics might be unfamiliar. So according to CDC, 81% of the US population received at least one dose of the COVID vaccine by now, and 92% among those 18 and older, right? And 69% of the general population received the complete primary series, and almost 79% among those 18 and older. And then when it comes to boosters, especially the updated bivalent booster, about 16% of the US general population received the booster. That number increased to 19% among those 18 and older. And here's a graph pretty much, giving you a sense of vaccine uptake over time. And we see some peaks and valleys, and mostly driven by the availability of various vaccine doses. And also we notice that on a tail end, we see a small uptick of vaccination, and that's spurred by the availability of the new updated booster, which became available on September the 1st, 2022, I think. Okay, so we are probably in agreement, hopefully so, that vaccination is an important public health measure to contain and mitigate the pandemic, and also to enable us really to live with the virus in the future. As I mentioned, an updated booster became available in September 2022, and there's already evidence showing that the updated booster is a very important public health measure, right? Data from November 2022 shows that people ages 5 and older and vaccinated with an updated booster had almost 13 times lower risk of dying from COVID-19 compared to unvaccinated people. Now, compared to people who are vaccinated without the updated booster, they have 2.4% times lower risk of dying from COVID-19. So there's strong evidence suggesting that boosters are effective. Okay, so what do we want to investigate in our study? We focus on the uptake of vaccine boosters among individuals who have received at least one vaccination shot already. Okay, so in some ways, we're not talking to the pocket of vaccine skeptics, in the general population. We are looking at a more friendly population, one way to put it, right? And we want to know, if message fatigue is a factor in their decision to, receive a booster shot. Okay, so that's our kind of a starting point. That's our first general research question. And we investigate this research question mainly in a framework of the health belief model, right? So we know that according to health belief model, perceived susceptibility, perceived severity, perceived benefits, and the perceived barriers are important predictors, among other things. But we would also like to pull in perceived norms, and I will make it clear in just a little bit. So it's not the traditional health belief model, it's health belief model plus perceived norms. And this is a simple diagram to show what we intend to do, right? We look at the relationship between message fatigue and booster uptake among the vaccinated population. At the same time, we also want to see if any of that relationship may be accounted for by the HBM variables plus perceived norms, right? So I have some dotted lines in this diagram because I don't have time to share everything, all the results from our analysis. So those are things that we have looked at, but we will not be able to share in detail in this talk. And also, some of those relationships actually will come up in additional analysis that we have done to address the next research question, which is looking at, we are interested in exploring message fatigue as a social ecological factor. All right. So one thing that we know about fatigue is that it can be contagious, right? Really, I remember reading the very famous book, The Tipping Point by Gladwell, and he writes actually about how yawning can be really infectious, right? When you see other people yawn, you can't help but yawn yourself, right? Actually, there's interesting research showing that people not only yawn when they see other people yawn, they actually yawn when they see like fish, cats, and dogs yawn. Okay, so it's a very strong, form of contagion. All right, so we suspect that if people are surrounded by other people in their communities that have expressed strong sentiment of fatigue, maybe that will do something to their own feelings of fatigue, and also how their personal feelings of fatigue might factor in their risk perceptions and health behaviors, right? And we consider message fatigue in the environment to be a strong normative cue, right? We know from the literature that normative influences are very important to consider in health behaviors. And also multi-level influences and the interaction of those influences, both on the individual level and on the community levels, they are recognized as the core principles of ecological models of health behavior, right? So bringing those schools of thoughts together, we ask, will community level message fatigue predict booster uptake, the risk perception variables in the health belief model, and perceived norms? And also, we investigate whether there would be any cross-level interactions. So this is another diagram, right, showing the relationships that we're interested in. So instead of just individual level message fatigue, we now also have community level message fatigue, and we want to investigate both the direct contribution of community level message fatigue to the outcome variables, and also the potential of community level message fatigue to moderate the relationship between individual level message fatigue and outcomes. Okay. Data source. As I mentioned before, we obtained our data from the COVID States project, and this is a large surveillance system, primarily supported by the National Science Foundation. And its mission includes, the intention to seek to identify links between social behaviors and the virus transmission, as well as an impact of messaging and regulation on individual and community outcomes. All right. So our data were collected in the form of an add-on module. The COVID State project issued a call for many kind of proposals or mini modules that you can piggyback on their main data collection effort. So we were fortunate enough to put in a proposal that was selected, and our data were collected in wave 24, and we have a sample size of over 16,000, and data were collected between August 11th and September the 13th, 2022. And the sample provider was Pure Spectrum, an online panel management platform. The sample was not generated using, probability-based sampling methods. Instead, there were, very careful quotas that were set to reflect state-level demographics. Okay, and there was also oversampling of African Americans, Asians, and Hispanic respondents. But for our research purpose, only those having received at least one vaccine dose were included, right? And we weighted our data to align with population characteristics of the vaccinated population in the United States. So key measures, because this is an add-on module in a very large survey, we don't have the real estate to include a very elaborate measure of message fatigue. So these are the items that we used, mainly based on the Zhao et al. Framework. Okay, I've lost track of how many times I've heard that COVID-19 is a serious problem. COVID-19 prevention messages rarely provide new information. When I think about COVID-19, I feel mentally exhausted. I've heard enough about COVID-19 and don't want to hear any more about it. So all of the items are rated on 5-point Likert scale. The alpha is not stellar, but I think given that it's a 4-item scale, it's acceptable. And we have obviously measures of some other important variables: current COVID-19 booster status, yes versus no; perceived susceptibility, one item ranging from extremely unlikely to extremely likely to get infected; perceived severity, one item, how serious it is to, the symptoms will be if you get infected. So it's not at all to vary. Perceived benefits, we have 4 items focusing on benefits to self and others. Perceived barriers, mostly focused on, the safety and effectiveness of the vaccines. We also have 2 items measuring perceived norms, one on descriptive norm, one on injunctive norm. So all of the measures where we use multiple items seem to have good psychometric properties. The alphas are pretty good, and the correlation between the 2 item scale on perceived norm is pretty robust. Some other measures include COVID-19 diagnosis, side effects experienced from previous vaccination, general health status, demographics. Okay, so our analysis, we did 2 sets of analysis. The first, to address the first research question, we run logistic regression. For the second research question, we run multi-level modeling. Now, obviously, there is the possibility of addressing both questions within the context of multi-level modeling, but as you will see shortly, that we made some decisions about, who to include in the multi-level modeling analysis. So we felt like it's still worth, presenting the single-level analysis, the logistic regression in response to research question 1. All of the models controlled for a pretty long list of background variables, demographics, general health status, political leaning, previous experience with COVID and vaccination, and also main sources of COVID information. All right, just very quickly, I'm not going to show you all the sample characteristics, but in our sample, roughly half of the sample have not received a booster shot. Oh, by the way, this is a quick but important footnote. That is, our data were collected right before data collection started right before the updated booster became available, right? And even though the data collection period extended beyond September the 1st, vast majority of the data were collected before the updated booster was released. So, in the survey and also the data, when we talk about booster, it really was about the previous booster shot, not the updated booster. So within a sample, 52.9% have not received a booster shot. And then, among the rest of the sample, some of them received 1 dose, some of them received both doses, 2 doses. Now, in terms of perceptions, just very quickly, most perceptions are pretty moderate, around the midpoint, slightly above or below, okay? And the distribution of all of the variables looks pretty decent. So message fatigue, right? This is what we care about. The weighted mean of message fatigue is 3.47 or 48. And when you use the midpoint as the cutoff point, 67% of the respondents scored above the midpoint. So you can say that roughly 2/3 of the sample expressed some measure of fatigue. Okay, so research question 1, is message fatigue associated with booster uptake, right? So in light of the model that we looked at earlier, we want to look at this relationship both with and without the health belief model variables and perceived norms in a model, right? So first, we looked at it without those additional predictors. Obviously, we still have the long list of control variables in a model. And the odds ratio is 0.69. Okay, it's highly significant. And when you look at the margins, it's pretty clear that there's a fairly strong negative relationship between experienced message fatigue and booster uptake. Now, after we included the health belief model variables and perceived norms in the model, the odds ratio was still significant and it was still negative. All right, so you can say that even after very stringent control, there still is a relationship between message fatigue and odds of having received a booster shot. Okay, moving on to the second research question. Is county level message fatigue associated with booster uptake and the perception variables, right? Now, the way that we operationalized community level, message fatigue is to, calculate the county level mean for each participant, each respondent, right? Now, for this analysis, we only included respondents who are from counties where there are at least 15 respondents. Okay, when you look at a sample, actually, there's a lot of participants or respondents who, who are in counties where they are the single representative. We just don't feel like it's a good idea to include those in this analysis. So we calculated the mean message fatigue for each county, and then individual level message fatigue was group mean centered, so that we can interpret, what's going on there. And we didn't weight the analysis because we only have a level 1 weight, and including those weights likely will screw up the analysis. Okay, so we first look at current booster status. Okay, whether a respondent has received a booster or not. All right, and we did not include other health belief model variables and perceived norms, not because we didn't want to try, but because the model would crash if we include those additional predictors. And this is a multi-level logit model. It seems like it's more delicate, and we're still investigating. So keep that in mind when you look at these results. But we do see a significant cross-level interaction, right? So what does the data look like? And here's a plot of that interaction. So overall, individual level fatigue, obviously has a negative relationship with booster uptake. And this relationship becomes more negative or stronger in a negative direction when the county level mean message fatigue becomes higher. Okay, so when people are surrounded by other people who express significant fatigue, their personal experience of fatigue will have a stronger negative association with booster uptake. So the next outcome we looked at, because we conceptualize, community level or the county level message fatigue as a important cue, for normative information, right? So we suspect that there should be some relationship between county level message fatigue and perceived norms. Okay, so once again, we see a very clear cross-level interaction. Okay, when you look at the pattern of the results, we see a similar pattern, right? So individual level fatigue is overall negatively associated with perceived norms. So people who experience or report more fatigue would perceive less supportive norms surrounding getting a vaccine booster. Okay, and this relationship became stronger, greater in magnitude, negative direction when the level of county level mean message fatigue becomes higher. And the next question is county level message fatigue associated with perceived susceptibility? Even though the question is about county level message fatigue, we do have, individual level message fatigue in the model. So, you can get a sense of how individual level message fatigue is associated with those variables, those outcome variables by looking at the results. And interestingly, with the perceived susceptibility, we don't see anything going on. Okay, neither on the individual level nor on the community level or county level. By the way, there's no cross-level interaction, so that interaction term was dropped from the model. Now, the next outcome we looked at is perceived severity. Okay, once again, here we don't see a cross-level interaction. We don't see, a main effect of county mean message fatigue, but we do see a main effect of individual level message fatigue. right? It's a strong negative association, not surprisingly. Those experiencing stronger message fatigue reported less perceived, severity of a COVID infection. Now, the next outcome is perceived benefits, right? By the way, I want to clarify that when we talk about perceived susceptibility and severity, those are with respect to a COVID infection, right? When it comes to benefits and barriers, that's about, the vaccines, right? So here, once again, we see a cross-level interaction, and the pattern would be much easier to interpret by looking at a graph. So we have a graph. Once again, we see the same pattern. Okay, those individual level message fatigue is associated with lower perceived benefits, and that association becomes more negative. When the community level or county level message fatigue becomes stronger. Now, finally, we look at the relationship between county level message fatigue and the perceived barriers. Okay, so here, once again, we don't see a cross-level interaction, but we do see a main effect of the individual level message fatigue, and we don't see a main effect of a county level mean message fatigue, right? Now, the nature of the relationship between individual level message fatigue and perceived barriers is such that people reporting greater levels of fatigue tend to report greater perceived barriers to getting a vaccine booster. So it makes sense. Okay, I'm moving through pretty quickly. So what we have learned from this analysis suggests that COVID message fatigue was moderately high among the vaccinated respondents, with 2/3 expressing at least some fatigue. Okay, so I think it's fair to say that it's prevalent. Okay, now you can argue just how strong is strong, right? But I think with the majority of the sample scoring above the midpoint, agreeing to some extent that they are experiencing fatigue, does speak to the widespread existence of the phenomenon. And in both analyses, really, the single level logistic regression and the multi-level modeling, message fatigue on the individual level was associated with lower odds of having received at least one booster shot. Okay, and it's a pretty robust relationship because our models controlled for a lot of other variables, including previous experience with COVID and previous experience with COVID vaccination. And then we also included the major predictors, from the health belief model and also perceived norms. Okay, and above and beyond all of that, we still observed a negative relationship between message fatigue on the individual level and the odds of having received a booster shot. Okay. Now, we also found that the county level average of message fatigue moderated the relationship between individual level message fatigue and 3 outcomes. Booster uptake. Now, granted that we're still sort of tinkering with that model because we were able to run a model without the HBM predictors and perceived norm, but we're trying to find out why the model wouldn't converge when we have those variables in the model. But we have very clear evidence when it comes to perceived benefits and the perceived norms that county level message fatigue is a significant moderator. All right. And it's important to know, actually, I didn't show the results, but in the analysis, we saw that perceived benefits and perceived norms are the 2 strongest predictors of booster uptake, right? So message fatigue is associated with the strongest predictors in the HBM framework, the strongest predictors of booster uptake, okay, both on the individual level and on the community level, right? Overall, we saw that counties with greater average fatigue showed stronger negative relationships, right, between individual level message fatigue and those outcomes. So taken together, I think we see pretty good evidence showing that message fatigue is a real and consequential problem, okay, for the continued promotion of COVID-19 vaccine boosters. Okay. Now, this research has a few strengths, right? It has a very large national sample, and it's specifically focused on booster uptake, arguably probably the most important protective measure during the current stage of the pandemic, and also looking forward into the future, right? And we investigated both individual level and community level associations and mechanisms. But there are also some important limitations. This is cross-sectional data. So all we're seeing here are relationships, right? And how to interpret the relationships is always a fair question to ask with this kind of data. And we have a limited measure of message fatigue. We have only 4 items. They hand together in factor analysis, but alpha is not great. And actually, there's also, I think, a good question to ask as to, whether those subdimensions of message fatigue would behave similarly, in this sort of analysis. We did explore that a little bit. Overall, very interesting, actually. Overall, the pattern of relationships tend to be the same across those items. But when it comes to strength, especially in terms of the strength between, message fatigue and booster uptake, it's the first dimension that had the strongest relationship. So it's perceived overexposure that had the strongest association with the behavior outcome. Okay. We have some sample constraints in multi-level analysis, which was the reason why we presented both the single-level analysis, which used the full sample, and then multi-level analysis that used a subsample. So there is always the possibility that respondents that are removed from the sample might represent a special group. They might be characterized, in important ways that we don't know about. So this could introduce some bias in analysis. All right, so this is really the last slide that I want to share with you, but I really look forward to discussing this with you. I think a good question to ask is, how should we conceptualize the relationship between message fatigue and other behavior predictors? I think evidence from this analysis is clear in a sense that, obviously our focus, my presentation was focused on the relationship between message fatigue and booster uptake. But, we also examined the relationship between message fatigue and all the predictors. As shown in a multi-level analysis, message fatigue was not associated with perceived susceptibility, but it was associated with everything else, right? So there's definitely a link there. But then after accounting for, those HBM variables and perceived norms, we still see a relationship between message fatigue and booster uptake. So something else is going on there, and we don't quite understand, why that is, right? So there's a lot of room for careful thinking and the conceptualization of the relationship between message fatigue with not only the behavior outcome, but also the other predictors of the behavior outcome. And related to that, there's the question of what are the mechanisms of its impact if we can interpret, the pattern of associations that we have observed in causal terms, right, very tentatively. Then what are some of the potential mechanisms responsible for its impact both on the individual and community levels, right? Now, I think to us who are interested in health communication, really for both theoretical and practical reasons, I think the most important question of them all is, what can we do about message fatigue? There's some discussion in the literature, right? So a few general directions that have been mentioned include optimizing exposure. So you want to generate enough exposure. By the way, for a lot of intervention efforts, exposure is a problem, not because, there's too much, but because there's too little. And COVID is an exception, right? We have lived through this extended, period of just bombardment of public health messaging. So in this particular context, okay, exposure is a problem because of its abundance, right? So maybe one way to address message fatigue is to strategize exposure and optimize exposure, right? And then maybe there's room for better targeting, okay? So once again, in a pandemic context, a lot of the public health messages are directed at the general public. Everybody, receive the same messages at a high volume, right? So maybe, once again, better planning can be implemented where people who are most in need of information will receive more, whereas people who are less at risk might receive less, okay? So that they don't suffer from message fatigue. Now, there's also the matter of message design. You want to design messages that can break through, right? That can, tear down the resistance from message fatigue. Novel messages in general, right? Messages that have features that can grab attention, can retain interest, right? Can get people engaged. Now, related to that, there's also, the general strategy of reframing, okay? So there's already some interesting research showing that when it comes to message fatigue, for example, when you focus on health consequences, which is obviously physical health consequences, which is obviously a very predominant theme in a world of health communication, you tend to see more message fatigue. Whereas if you focus on, for example, mental health consequences of obesity or diabetes, you tend to see less message fatigue, right? So reframing a healthy issue, reframing the information might give you some advantage in terms of overcoming message fatigue. All right. That's really all I have to say. Thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome your questions and comments.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Zhao. As you know, I'm not a big fan of correlational analysis, like cross-sectional analysis. I always want to look into the causality, but the data you've presented today are pretty damning, right? Was like, wow. I mean, the patterns are consistent with, regard to the main effects and the interaction and the big data set you have. I don't know if anyone can still say, oh, we don't need to worry about message fatigue, because what you're presenting today seems like it's pretty convincing to me, even with my skepticism toward cross-sectional kind of analysis. So I have a lot of questions, but I'm gonna hold them until everyone else's questions have been addressed. So let's open it up to questions, and feel free to raise your digital hand, or you can put your questions in the chat. So we'll attend to them one by one. I do see that Peter left a question in the chat. Peter, why don't you go ahead and ask Dr. Zhao this very important question that I think we need to get it clarified before we move on to the broader questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Zhao. It was nice to hear your presentation. I'm here in Lima, Peru, so it's also nice to catch up with this research. Just as you were going through the selection of the variables, I was wondering how you measured both injunctive and descriptive norms. It was a 2-item measure. That will help me understand better the process.
All right, great. Thank you for the question. So if I remember correctly, I think I do. We basically asked, how many of the people around you have got the booster shot? So that's a, behavioral norm, right? Descriptive norm. And then we have a question about, do people who are important to you think that you should, get a booster shot? So that speaks to the injunctive norm. Yeah, so those are the 2 items. I'm not sure about exact wording, but that's the essence of the question.
So it's in line with the Fishman and Eisen's model.
Right.
I'll have to come. Okay, thank you.
All right. Any other questions? You can just raise your hand. I can see, I think I can see all of you. Or you can put it in the chat if you're too shy to ask questions yourself. Um, I
Oh,
okay, so
Shelly,
we
there's a
have,
hand from
yeah, Hi Ming
Ming.
King.
Hi, thank you so much for such great presentation. So there are so many interesting findings, and it got me really interested in the. I mean, we briefly discussed this earlier with Dr. Na, and Dr. Zhao also mentioned this during the presentation as well about the causal directions. I was specifically interested in the causal relationship between the perceived benefits and the message fatigue. So message fatigue could be in line with the health belief model. Message fatigue could be influencing some way in the predicting the perceived benefits. But I also thought the other way could be possible, especially given that the participants here are those people who got vaccinated already. So it might be likely that they have pretty much high level of perceived benefits, and that's why they got the vaccines. And because of that, based on that perceived benefits, maybe that also put them in some position that they might get, well, I know the benefits of it, and that's why I got the vaccinations myself. And that kind of led to the message fatigue as well, because they already know the benefits. So I was wondering if there was any part from your analysis that you kind of compare these different directions between the relationship between message fatigue and the perceived benefits?
That's a good question. I don't think we have analyzed the data that way, but it's certainly something that we can explore. By the way, things are sort of freezing on my end. Can you still hear me?
Yeah,
You don't
yeah,
move.
we can hear you because but your picture is frozen. But let's see if there's a
Okay.
problem. But
All right, hopefully this will still do, because your pictures are frozen on my end too. But anyway, great question. I think it's a very good question. And obviously, you know, we're always very careful when talking about causal relationship based on just cross-sectional data. So, you know, even though the kind of theoretical conceptual models that we looked at strongly suggest, you know, a certain kind of direction of causality, but the data themselves are not able to firmly establish it, right? So it's entirely possible that people might infer, you know, from their prior experience, you know, how much benefits they have obtained from, you know, previous vaccination, and then maybe, you know, they would infer from that still that how much fatigue they're experiencing when it comes to the booster shot. But just to clarify that, you know, the perceived benefits questions are about the booster, right? And we have, you know, people's vaccination status and actually not vaccination status, but COVID status, diagnosis, previous diagnosis, and also previous experience with the vaccination in the model. So that hopefully can account for some of the ambiguity, not by sort of sorting through the causal direction, but by removing some of the confounding from the model. But still, I think, you know, you have raised a good question, and I don't think we'll be able to provide a completely satisfactory answer to it, but we can certainly explore, for example, the relationship between message fatigue and the perceived benefits among those who have received, you know, the booster shot versus those who have not received the booster shot.
Thank you.
yeah, Catherine.
Yeah, thank you so much for this great talk. And I had a somewhat similar question about, you know, maybe is it possible the relationship is reversed because, you know, people could be really fatigued with the pandemic overall, not so much the messages, like they could be fatigued with lockdowns and quarantine or school closures or business closures. And I know you controlled for partisanship and so forth, but I'm just curious if it's possible that they're other fatigue with the pandemic is causing them to just say, well, I'm done, I'm done with these messages, and not so much the other predictors?
Yeah, once again, a fair question, and it's completely possible. We don't have data to address that. Maybe, when you think about pandemic fatigue, when you think about the kind of role of message fatigue within the broader framework of pandemic fatigue, maybe the next step for some research is to see how message fatigue is related to other forms of fatigue, and whether a unique relationship can be established between message fatigue and outcomes that we care about after controlling for those, forms of the other forms of fatigue. But I think, we are coming into territories where things can become really tricky, because I would imagine those different forms of fatigue will be very strongly correlated. Throwing all of them into a model may or may not work. We'll have to see. But conceptually, I think you have definitely a good point there.
Yeah, great question. Any other questions coming from the audience? Dr. Zhao seems to be coming back, but still kind of frozen a little bit. But we can hear you, so that's an important thing. Zhuan Jie.
Yeah, so I mean, as other people who attended the seminar, thank you so much, Dr. Zhao, for this presentation. So it's very intriguing. So I have two questions, and one is more of a clarification question, and the second one is something that I would like to hear your insights. So the first one is, I'm very intrigued by the multi-level analysis that you conducted. So I'm curious whether you have seen much across county variation in terms of the perceived message fatigue. So do you see like some counties reported very low message fatigue and others relatively higher? So that's more of a kind of clarification question for the data. And the second question is, so based on the conceptualization of message fatigue, and seems to me, no matter it's the individual level or the county level or collective level, the message fatigue has to be a result of overexposure of messages over time. So I'm curious about, what's your insight on how we can get the overexposure to messages or repeated messages over time? Like, how can we get to observe, the cause right there? So those are my two questions.
Okay, thank you for the questions. Excuse me. So for the first question, great question, and we actually did look at message fatigue and treating it as a dependent variable in multi-level modeling. We did see some county to county variation, not a whole lot, and we did run some models. Obviously you see the usual suspects. For example, political leaning is a big factor on an individual level. And we also included some county level predictors. So those are variables that I haven't really talked about, but we did try, pulling in, for example, county level income level, right, education level, county population size, so on and so forth. And we didn't really see a very clear relationship between the other county level characteristics and message fatigue on the county level, but we did see in a null model, observe some level of between level variation in the data. So that's a response to your first question. No, I forgot what your second question is. Can you remind me what you said?
Yeah. So the second question is, I think the conceptualization of message fatigue. So no matter it's at the collective level or individual level, it should be a result of overexposures to repeated messages over extended period of time.
Right.
So I think I'm curious about, what's your thoughts are in terms of how we can observe the overexposure of repeated measures over an extended period of time. Like how can we observe or operationalize the cause there?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, if you figure that one out, you can introduce a lot of clarity, to our understanding in terms of the causal relationship, among some of the things that we're talking about today. If I understand you correctly, you're talking about sort of observing overexposure beyond just based on, people's self-report, right?
Exactly.
For example, our
Yes.
measure of message fatigue is basically just asking people, right? Have you experienced this? So, I think some sort of surveillance system that can generate, can monitor how much messaging is happening, over time would be helpful, although I don't know if it's entirely feasible. Okay, but maybe we can introduce additional dimensions of variation, for example, in terms of, in addition to time, we can also vary by location, that might give you a better handle on ways that have potential or promise to serve as sort of a exogenous measure of overexposure. But if we do have, such a measure, then it would be tremendously helpful.